Hello guys, welcome to another Source Gaming discussion. This is your host Push Dustin, and joining me today is video lead of Source Gaming, Nintenjax.
Hello.
And we are here today to discuss the Indie Gold Rush on the Nintendo Switch. Now, while I was at Tokyo Game Show, I talked to a lot of video game developers, and there's a kind of a mixed reception to this. With Nintendo Switch being such a new system, there's kind of a strong incentive to go out and make indie games or make games for the Switch to put on the eShop. Some developers see this as a very positive thing, while some other developers see this as a really negative thing. Some developers have kind of drew parallels to the California Gold Rush and called it the Indie Gold Rush on the Switch. So Nintenjax, what do you think about this?
Well, for starters, I think that the idea that the Switch is a good platform for indies right now, and that's not really something that's exclusive to the Switch, to be honest. Well, I think when the PlayStation 4 came out, when it also didn't have that many games, indies were obviously the big thing because they were the only thing you could get. And so I think that what we're seeing now is just something that's naturally was going to happen eventually. Like, the longer the lifespan of the system goes, the more games it's going to get, the more some are going to get lost in the shuffle, and the more choice, more options, then people are going to be spreading their cash, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
So none of this is really a surprise. I think there are ways that we can go about to manage the way that indies are, because indies are obviously going to be worried about it. Back when they released their game back in March or April, then there wasn't really anything to compete with. They got the front page slot on the eShop, etc. And now I think the best example is last week or 2 weeks ago when 21 odd games came out on the eShop all at once. Basically knocked anything off that came out the week before completely off the eShop's front page. And some of those 21 games, if they were at the bottom, most people probably wouldn't scroll down that far, so you'd have to be pretty lucky and get the top slot.
Yeah, one thing is that the eShop on the Switch isn't that well organized.
No.
It's very easy to not be able to find any games. If you don't know what you're looking for, if you're not a hardcore fan or if you're not really interested in a particular game, then it's very hard to just discover games.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Nintendo now needs to work on. It was fine when there wasn't much on there, but now that we're seeing more and more games get added and their shop's getting more extensive, they need to. It needs a UI update. Maybe have stuff split into categories so you can look for games per genre, or let people search for games per publisher, or have special tags that people can add to find stuff. Have a highlight thing, maybe if a game gets a lot of good reviews, you can have a section for well-received games, or if a game hasn't had many downloads but is getting a positive reception, you could have a hidden gems kind of tab. I think Nintendo needs to go through ways of making sure that they don't release too many games at once, and making the eShop something that is easier to use to find all these games that you're looking for. Otherwise, it's going to end up like something like Steam. Steam is not that great to use, in my personal opinion, and there are so many games released at once that it's just a nightmare to find anything that's kind of new. That's why they do introduce stuff like the ambassadors and other search options to try and make some of these games actually get noticed.
Yeah, I would say the only way that you can really discover new games on the Switch is by checking out your friends list and see what your friends are playing and see how many hours they're putting into those games. That's the only way that I kind of naturally discover it, but it's not really a good way. I thought the eShop on the 3DS was very well designed. I thought the 3DS had a lot of great categories and it was regularly updated. I don't know why they kind of dropped the ball with the Switch.
See, I don't think the 3DSs didn't really have all them categories, I think, from the start. I think they had new releases, Virtual Console as a separate thing, and whenever there were special offers, they had a separate tab for them. Back when it first began, I think it was pretty basic, and I think the Switch is just going to follow the same sort of route. They clearly wanted to make it more snazzily designed and something that fits the whole Switch's UI compared to what it was on the 3DS and Wii U. And I think over time, when more games start to get added, they're going to realise, even their own games, that people aren't buying them because there's too much stuff or they can't even find them. And I would say even right now, in Nintendo's headquarters, they're probably looking, and they've probably already begun updating the eShop to accommodate for all this. I think that's a lot. I think the Switch's overall UI, there's a lot of stuff there that's hinted at, for, like themes and folders and stuff like that we don't have access to yet, but are definitely coming down and in the pipeline because it needs it really badly.
Yeah. Yeah, the Switch is it's great because it starts up quickly and there's, it's very intuitive, but it's also lacking a lot of those key features, as we've mentioned so many times in discussion already. One thing that I heard from a lot of developers is that they're worried that the market is kind of being oversaturated because there's so many games coming out that their games don't really have a chance to compete. You might see a lot of games who fall off the radar pretty quickly and just don't get noticed because there's so much competition. I mean, if you just look in the last couple weeks, we had Golf Story, Earth Atlantis, then pretty soon we have Yono coming out. It's an endless stream of games that are being hyped by the community, but they're coming out so quickly after each other that I'm not sure if the community really has the time to digest those games or other games that aren't, being highlighted by the community.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think this is something that is probably an issue that can't really be resolved that well. There are a ton more indie developers now than there were 10 years ago. It's much easier to make games now. Open source game development toolkits and all that are pretty easy to come by, and the Switch has tried to make itself as accessible as possible because of this. And so the only way to do that is to space out releases, but then who decides this? Does Nintendo decide, okay, it's going to release at this time, or does the dev decide? Like, did the dev of Golf Story be like, okay, we want to aim for their end of September release? Because I think they did, but if all the devs are doing that, Nintendo can't turn around. Nintendo's not going to turn around and be like, okay, no, we're not releasing your game at this time because there are too many games or anything like that. They're going to accommodate for everyone, and I think that's an issue that can't be stopped, really. Yeah. Like, unless every single dev got together and was like, no, we're setting up a massive release calendar, making sure nothing clashes, but that's way too unrealistic.
One dev I talked to did mention kind of a natural bottleneck existing with Nintendo because they have to approve those games. They have to make sure that the games don't lock the console.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, so, the developer said that there's a kind of a natural bottleneck and that there isn't really a lot to worry about with the amount of releases, but I just worry that people are kind of getting overwhelmed with the releases.
Yeah, and I mean, they are. I mean, that's the short part of it. People can't play every single game that's on there. I struggle to play every single game that I have. And there are some games that I really want to try. Some games I've had to just drop because I've either got stuff in the way. And it's getting harder and harder to do that. So I haven't played any of those games. I was somewhat interested in Golf Story because I liked the old Game Boy Advance Mario games. But I don't have the time. And it's not it's not like one of the top priority, like golf sports games in general aren't like my big focus. So unless I manage to find a time in months from now where for some reason I'm not playing anything, then maybe I'll grab it. But until then it won't happen, and it's like that with a ton of games. There's a lot of games, like even Fire Emblem Warriors I'm looking really forward to, but I don't know if I'm going to have the time to actually play it yet, so I might have to hold off getting it. That's something that a lot of people are facing, and there's no way we can avoid that. That's the problem.
I guess this is a payback for the complete dry spell that the end of the Wii U had.
Yes,
we were complaining that there's no games for the Wii U, and now we have too many games.
Yeah, you want to release it on the Wii U, because the people who haven't moved over yet from the Wii U to the Switch are struggling for stuff at the moment.
Yeah. Well, that also kind of relates to a very interesting point. I think it was I'm blanking on the developer's name, but they released a game on the 3DS and it didn't sell well, and they say that indie games on the 3DS aren't selling well because everyone kind of moved onto the Switch. Was it Tiny Pebble?
Maybe. I don't know. This is the first I've heard that.
Okay.
It doesn't really surprise much. Yes and no. I mean, the 3DS still has a big install base, I imagine. But you're right, a lot of the more hardcore people may have already moved over to the Switch, or just may not be looking to buy 3DS games. Like, we've seen people who go mad over Nintendo releasing some 3DS games, like the Metroid, for example, or Mario Party, instead of releasing them on the Switch. And I think a lot of those people clearly don't want their 3DS anymore and are willing to move away from it to do stuff like that, because 3DS is now seen as the last gen system. But I think that games are still selling on the 3DS and there's less coming out. So in situations like that, I don't necessarily know if the system itself is really that to blame. It's hard to tell without looking at like all the eShop charts and all the indie games that came out and seeing how well each of them sold. Like if it's multi-platform, and it came out for Switch as well, then I can imagine people who were interested in it getting it on Switch instead of 3DS. But people who still have 3DS as their main console and haven't upgraded to Switch yet will still be willing to buy games they find interesting on the 3DS, obviously. So I'm not necessarily convinced that just because the Switch is out, that means indie games just won't sell on the 3DS, as if that's a new thing. Like, if indie games didn't do well on the 3DS, then I have a feeling they haven't done well for a long time, and not just because the Switch is out.
All in all, do you think that the amount of indie games for the Switch is a good thing or a bad thing, or do you think that Nintendo just needs to fix the eShop?
I think the best option to go about it is to fix the eShop. I mean, we don't want, obviously, a ton of games in the way that Steam gets, but Steam gets something like 100 games a day, or it did at one point. Whereas the 21 games on the eShop was seen as a surprise event, and it hasn't hit that since then. So I feel like, while we obviously do get more and more games in there, having more options to play is still a good thing, but this isn't something that could be avoided, really. So rather than trying to fix the problem, they should be trying to work with the problem to find a way of dealing with it, essentially. And I think the only way to do that is either through massive PR stories, because despite what I've been saying about Golf Story and me personally, Golf Story clearly had a lot of hype behind it, and I think it sold well to reflect that, regardless of the fact that there were 20 other games it was competing with. Whereas I imagine some of those games that didn't have quite as much of the PR representation probably did flounder.
Like Astro Bears.
Like Astro Bears. Like, that one probably didn't do nearly as well as Golf Story did. And they had the same problems on the eShop, but it was about public perception going into it. Like, people knew that Golf Story was coming out, so people were going to search for it. If indie devs are worried that they haven't really created a big enough image for their game, and they just want people to find it by, casually window shopping, essentially, on the eShop, then Nintendo need to sort out their eShop and make it more accessible. And I think they are doing that. They just haven't hit that point yet.
Yeah. I think it's more important than ever that indie devs really market the games to people as well. Because with Golf Story, like, that had a lot of hype behind it. I think it's partly because of the unique inspiration behind the game, the unique draw of the game. It was also because the development kind of built that hype, I believe.
Like, you can't just rely on Nintendo and the eShop and then blame them when things are going wrong.
Yeah.
Like, you need to do the work yourself to get people to notice your game, and then people, if they're interested in it, will go out and buy it. That's the reality of it, and they'll buy it over other people's games. So even if you're going up against lots of people, it's fine.
Yeah. I think that basically wraps up our discussion. You can follow us by checking out the social media links in the description below. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this in the future. I'm Push Dustin, and this is Nintenjex, signing off.
Bye.